Today's Q&A session is on the music of Bach on the classical guitar. And thank you to all my Patreon followers for submitting questions today. I'll try to give you a little answer for each one. And if you're interested in joining my Patreon, there's a link for that in the description. Quite a few questions to answer today, so my answers are going to have to be pretty short, despite the fact that I could probably talk for a very long time about each question. So we'll dive right in and I'll try to mention a few key points. So Cliff asks, did Bach actually write any music for the classical guitar or even the lute? I see a lot of guitar recordings of arrangements and transcriptions of Bach's work, but are there any Bach guitar or lute works that are definitely written by the master? The first thing I'll say is that Bach didn't write for the classical guitar. The closest equivalent would be like the Baroque guitar, and there's not a lot of evidence that Bach even interacted with the Baroque guitar. He might have seen some in someone's collection or something like that, but definitely not for the guitar. The lute, on the other hand, he interacted with the lute quite a bit. For example, he met Sylvius Weiss on a number of occasions, and they improvised stuff together, and he even included some of Weiss's music in a couple of his compositions. So he was very aware of lute. And the pieces that we call the lute suites were probably written on or for the Lutenwerk, like a lute-style keyboard instrument. And certainly they would fit a keyboard instrument more than the lute itself. However, it's not inconceivable that he could have imagined them being played on the lute, since he had so much interaction with lute players. And certainly he was either experimenting with thinner textures compared to his keyboard works, or was writing for that instrument with a thinner texture, or he was just imagining a very open-ended situation. And Bach was very used to arranging his music for different instruments and transferring and making arrangements for putting this music there and that music there on different instruments. So we shouldn't be thinking that he was closed-minded in that way. But for all intents and purposes, when we play Bach's music on the classical guitar, we are arranging it. And even when I was making my recent edition of the 996 suite, the amount of rewriting you have to do is sometimes quite extensive in terms of the range. We just need more strings. And Baroque lutes have a lot of strings, and which just really changes the game in terms of what you can do. On the classical guitar, we end up going all over the place on the neck, and there's crazy stretches, and it's just thick counterpoint. It's difficult. So it's always going to be an arrangement, regardless of what Bach wrote it for. But he definitely wrote a lot of those works, so we have them, and we can do something with them. And that's all part of the fun, like seeing people interpret his music is so interesting. And I'll talk about that with another question coming up. So Jonathan asks, he's recently been playing more Bach and listening to great recordings. In my own playing, I struggle to let the music breathe, as the written music often seems quite metronomic and unrelenting. I'd be interested in advice for adding articulation. My biggest piece of advice for you, Jonathan, is that listen to Bach's music on a variety of different instruments and the voice. When I was growing up, I would listen to lots of Glenn Gould and stuff, which I don't as much anymore. But I was really into that modern keyboard style, and Gould hams it up by making it very, very intense in that way. But when you start listening to Bach's music, for example, if you listen to the cantatas, you can hear musical lines being played on string instruments. You can hear the musical lines being sung. You can hear it on flutes. You can hear it on organ. You'll gain a wider perspective of what Bach's musical lines can sound like. Especially if you look at the score when you're doing that, because we can see sometimes in Bach's music a musical line, and we can imagine it being played on a keyboard in a very metronomic way. But then if you look at some 16th notes written out and you hear it sung, it's a really different experience. It can be super legato, and the phrasing can be very vocal style in terms of its phrasing and how legato it is, and how much push and pull there can be to the rhythm. So listen to a wide variety of instruments playing his music so that you have a clear awareness of what Bach's music can be. Because in the end, he didn't really write for the guitar, and so we're in this kind of funny position where we have to invent what we want, how we want to perform his music and interpret it on the guitar. So in terms of adding articulation, just by listening to a variety of performers and instruments, and specifically early music instruments, you will gain an awareness of what would be appropriate and what you like, what your personal preferences are for enjoying Bach, right? Okay, Marc asks, I'd love to get into playing Baroque music, Bach and Scarlatti in particular, but find it quite intimidating. Any tips on where to start and with what pieces? Good question, Marc. And really, when it comes to Bach and Scarlatti, and Baroque music as a whole, but particularly Bach and Scarlatti, we're kind of talking about playing keyboard music on the guitar. And so there's like an athletics or like a technique element there. So your technique just has to be high. Without a lot of technique and athleticism on the instrument, it's really tough to play counterpoint and to play particularly Bach and Scarlatti. That said, some of the slower pieces really just require lots of finger independence and musical knowledge about counterpoint and how to interpret that. So my advice is that you have to work your way up. So, going through some graded systems, whether it be mine or the conservatories or, whatever, but working your way up, there's usually in these graded systems, there'll be like, grade 1 Baroque pieces, grade 2 Baroque pieces. And you might not get your Bach and Scarlatti in right away, but you'll gain experience with Baroque music at different levels, and you work your way up, and you build that foundation, and eventually you can arrive and work on proper technique, because the requirements are going to be intense later, so you want to solidify proper technique now. And of course, listen to lots of Baroque music. The more that you are aware of the stylistic elements, the more that you'll be able to interpret them properly when you have good technique and lots of guitar skills. In regards to what pieces to start with, well, when it comes to Bach, a lot of pieces, there's a couple of like easier pieces at around the grade 6 level or so, such as the Prelude 999, and pieces like that that you can start with. But also the cello suites, arrangements of the cello suites are great because the texture is just a lot thinner. They're still very difficult, but certain movements of the cello suites can be very beneficial to practice, such as the cello suite number 1. But yeah, it's a long process, and just what you really want to do is enjoy more music from the Baroque era in general. You might find there's quite a few lute transcriptions and things like that, and Baroque guitar works that have lots of elements shared with Bach and Scarlatti that you can work on until you're ready for that next level. Stephen asks, he's asking about, I'm paraphrasing, but he's asking about the use of trills, slurs, and mordents for the period. Huge topic here. I can't get into it very much, so I'll just say a quick word about each one. Trills and mordents are ornaments that Bach definitely used, and other composers of the era definitely used. So yes, they're used quite a bit. I do have a video and a lesson on trills, and I talk a lot about Bach versus other Baroque guitarists, for example, and how they use those ornaments. So you can watch that video. But in Bach's music, it's very common to get upper auxiliary trills at cadences. So you reach the end of a phrase and there's a cadence, and often there will be a trill there. So definitely, and it's written into his music, it's in his scores. So it's very common. You can add a lot more, but I'll talk about that in just a moment. And mordents are used as well, particularly in Bach's slower movements. You can add them anywhere, but he actually does notate them in a lot of the the sarabands and things like that. Slurs are a funny thing. Slurs are hammer-ons and pull-offs in guitar lingo, right? Slurs are a technique that just facilitate legato. They facilitate legato, and also sometimes, if you want them to, create a strong, weak beat structure from like a strong to a weak feel, depending on how you play your slur. I always, whenever I start a Bach work, I always want to play it without slurs. It's like I just get into like a keyboard mode or something, and I want to play it without slurs and just have everything balanced, sounding balanced. But then I always end up adding slurs, partly to get more of a strong, weak feeling in there, but also just to facilitate legato and make it easier. Sometimes Bach's music can be unrelenting, and it just offers a lot of relief actually in the right hand, because I don't have to pluck every single note. And it just ends up being a little bit more legato sometimes. And especially if you're slurring from strong beats to weak beats, it can just help with break up the music and not make it like machine gun fire the whole time. You know, you can smooth it out a little bit. So I usually end up adding a lot of slurs in the end, even though I have this idealistic idea that I will always, not use them. So there's tons of information on this out there, but it's really up to you in the end. And to understand that slurs are just a way of playing a little bit more legato. Okay, Zachary has 2 questions. He says, to what extent are modern performers going against the spirit of the original tradition by avoiding any kind of improvisation beyond relatively minor ornamentations? So I actually think that there's 2 aspects to this. One aspect is that a lot of Bach performances are not done by early music specialists. So if you listen to early music specialists, they may improvise more than just the average classical guitarist. So even when you listen to, someone like David Russell, he's not adding a lot of ornamentation. But his recordings are brilliant and they're just wonderful. But he's not adding a lot of improvisation. He does add ornaments, of course. But if you listen to like Daniel Lapel's recent Bach release on a just intonation guitar, you can hear him add lots of ornamentation. It sounds very natural. It sounds very good. And if you listen to lute players, you're going to hear a lot of improvisation, depending on the player. There's also one more aspect, is that Bach is a little bit different than some of the other Baroque musicians. Bach's music is very compositionally focused and highly motivic everywhere. Like every note is accounted for, and there's motifs crammed into the music sometimes that you can't even see them. So it's so structured and the writing's so tight like that sometimes adding improvisation is not very practical. It might obscure some of the composition. And also, because the writing is so intense, the playing is very intense too. And so it's so demanding that adding anything extra is quite difficult. And that's why you'll see the majority of improvisation and ornamentation really happening in the slower movements, such as the sarabands, and occasionally in like the bourrées or something like that, in the more stately bourrées. But really, it's up to the performer, and but again, it's just not quite as suitable on Bach's music. In Weiss, the texture is so much thinner, and the lines are not quite as motivic all the time, and so adding improvisation just is much easier to do, and it doesn't feel like you're messing with the composer's intentions. Whereas with Bach, if you improvise and you obscure a motif, sometimes it feels like you're kind of washing over his composition, which is less desirable. Zachary also asks, I love so many renditions of Baroque pieces on multi-string guitars. 8 strings in particular seems like a sweet spot for this music. I'm wondering what your opinions are on such instruments. Do they open up new avenues of expression, or is it just more complication for not that much artistic payoff? It's a lot of effort to learn a new instrument with extra strings. There's a whole bunch more muscle memory you have to work on. So there's that, and also you have to get the instrument. So there's that too. So that just cuts out a lot of people. But there's very successful examples. Paul Galbraith, his guitar, that he holds differently and has a pin for it and everything. It has a lower bass string and a higher treble string, which makes a lot of sense because then you can play a lot more music just in first position without having to go up the neck for the high notes. That makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to playing lute music, which lutes have a lot more strings, but they're also tuned differently. So we're really just playing arrangements, and we have to really cram the music down. Like if you play Vice, like you got to change all those strings to it. There has to be, if there's like a descending bass line, you have to jump up at some point. There's just no getting around it. You have to arrange it so much. So playing on an instrument with more range allows you to play the music maybe more as it was written. Whether that's more gives you more artistic license, I don't really know. It gives you more options maybe, but not necessarily more artistic payoff. But it's really just comes down to the artist. I love 8-string instruments. I can't wrap my mind around either purchasing one, even though I probably will at some point, but also just like having to learn it as well. I might just go directly to a lute or something like that. But yeah, I love it. I love anyone kind of going for experimentation and trying something new and seeing how it works out, and it can be a real joy to listen to. Okay, Juan asks, do you have any tips for practicing voicing and counterpoint? I often find when playing Bach that my mind knows what voice or voices I want to highlight, but my fingers can have a hard time executing those ideas. Can you suggest some exercises to become more aware and better control the weight or strength of which each right-hand finger is playing? Well, of course, there's two elements. It's not just the right hand, there's the left hand, so we can talk about that. I already kind of discussed the fact that like you have to work your way up to this stuff, and I think when you're playing some of the more gallant composers of the Baroque era, that it's a lot thinner of a texture. So even though Weiss is really tough with stretches and stuff, his textures are much thinner and more flowing, and it can give you a lot of practice playing in a Baroque style without the intensity of like a Bach fugue or something like that. But in terms of actual exercises to do, finger independence is hugely important. Like even basic finger independence, when you keep fingers down and move fingers around, that's like a real common one, right? These two fingers are down, these ones are moving, because that's what's going to happen in counterpoint. I have a whole bunch of finger independence exercises in my technique book, but keeping fingers down while moving other fingers is just a really essential skill. Also, stretch exercises like O'Dare's drill or whatever equivalent in my book is really good, just like because that's what Baroque music ends up doing. You play bass lines and treble lines, and you have lots of left hand movement. Also, scales in different intervals can be really good. Scales in thirds, sixths, octaves, tenths. That's really great for the left hand as well. In terms of the right hand, like in my book, I have lots of exercises where you play a traditional arpeggio and you practice bringing out a different finger. Then the I finger. Then the M finger. A finger. There's like balance exercises in your right hand. And then there's also just like etudes. Like even some of the classical etudes like Carcassi, he has voice exchanges in there, and it gives you practice doing that. When it comes to Bach, so often the voices are quite equal in their importance, as opposed to maybe Weiss, where you would track a musical line through the piece. So it's more sometimes a question of just balancing all the voices and letting the music come out however it decides to come out. It's not quite like the Renaissance composers like da Milano, where you're really trying to bring out the imitation within one voice. Often in Bach, like all the voices are pretty important, regardless if there is a fugue motif in a voice, there's probably a counter subject or something that you have to bring out as well. So sometimes you don't bring things out quite that much, but it's really just practice. I mean, I think the biggest issue with most people is that they're usually playing pieces that are a little too advanced for them, and they just can't, actually handle it. So if you just play more music at a lower level, you can practice bringing out voices really well. And in the end, that's advice that most of us should consider. We do want to play Bach, but Bach is tough and his music is thick and we love it for that, but it's also very difficult to play. So there aren't a lot of easy Bach works. So I think we should gain a lot of our control and skills in the technique world and in just easier pieces, and just play those easier pieces really well, and get our ability to bring out voices honed in those easier works. But it sounds like if you know in your mind what you want to do, that's the really important first step, right? Music theory is just really important when it comes to playing this music, because it gives you an awareness of what you want to bring out and your knowledge of the music. And then if you have that knowledge and you have listening skills and you've listened to lots of music and you've studied music history and you have both a historical awareness of what's appropriate and a modern interpretation awareness, then as long as you have some technique there, you can go about doing that. But there's not a lot to it other than like just making sure that you build a strong foundation in your technique and in the playing of Baroque works, and that you're working your way up gradually enough that you're not mindlessly moving your fingers, but instead you are trying to bring things out. And I know that's very difficult sometimes. When I was doing the videos for 996, especially because I was like not preparing the pieces to their fullest extent. I was kind of doing them for my weekly videos. It was tough, and it's tough enough just to play the pieces. And so bringing out the counterpoint wonderfully, it was not always the primary thing that I was doing. Sometimes it was just keeping things balanced and rhythmic, and then letting the listener follow the musical line as they wish. But that's why you can play some of these pieces forever, is that your first time you play it, your first interpretation might be drastically different than the next one when you decide to bring out different voices and things like that. So it sounds like you're on the right track, but just, keep working away with honing your skills on easier pieces, and then you can attempt it gradually as you build your skills up. So thanks to everyone who submitted questions. There's a lot more information on Baroque music on the site, so just go to the lesson page. But also there's a ton of good books and resources, and I'll list some of those on the website.